Meanwhile, Kyiv's European allies will convene in Paris next Thursday to discuss the next steps in the peace process. The French President Emmanuel Macron saying leaders will aim to finalize short-term support and other security guarantees for the Ukrainian army. He also told reporters at a summit in Brussels he thinks the partial ceasefire is, quote, disappointing.
We are determined to achieve a solid and lasting peace, and so, in particular, we have obviously supported the American-Ukrainian proposal for a 30-day ceasefire to allow such discussions to begin. And in this respect, Russia's very disappointing partial response, I hope, is only a momentary refusal. In any case, it said something that we have been denouncing for several months, namely that Russia does not sincerely want peace at this stage.
And let's go straight to that summit in Brussels, where EU leaders have been gathering to discuss Ukrainian and European security. Our Sylvia Amaro joins us live now on the ground. Sylvia, just walk us through some of the conversations that you've been having.
So then, good to see you. We have witnessed the European Union taking unprecedented steps, mostly since the start of this month, when they came up with measures for more defense spending. We know that the EU has been under pressure from Russia, but growing so from the United States as well. So they are stepping up what they're doing in terms of more defense spending. And the measures that they have been developing so far this month account for up to 800 billion euros. However, though, in my conversations with European leaders yesterday here in Brussels, some of them were suggesting that these might not be enough, and further down the line, we could actually see even more meaningful spending for defense as well. Let me show you my exchange with the Latvian Prime Minister.
Latvia and Baltic countries and NBA always has been supporting stronger Europe, and that we need to spend more on our security and defense. We as Eastern border country, we understood that it is very important that Europe can provide more to military industry within Europe, and it can boost as well our economy. But for our military industry to grow and to develop technologies as well, we need to take away administrative burden, which is actually not helping our businesses to breathe and to grow.
Is it problematic that the proposal says buy European, 65% of the components need to be made in Europe?
You know, I believe it's advocacy for our own companies, but it doesn't say we cannot do it by our national budget. It's just in a case if we use European money. But this is one of the first proposals. I believe there will be needed more steps forward, and I'm open to discussion how we can even find more flexibility for our economy to grow and how we can boost our military industry, because industry can always bring new technologies which could be beneficial for Europe as such, actually.
So just to clarify, let me just clarify, I'm sorry. I just would like to clarify whether you are suggesting that what's on the table is not enough, and therefore we should see common borrowing, for instance. We need to go with that.
I believe we should discuss even more possibilities for financial resources, definitely.
So that was my conversation with the Latvian Prime Minister here in Brussels yesterday. And the reason why I wanted to show you that exchange is because the Europeans have been criticized in recent times that the proposal that they have on the table that includes 150 billion euros for loans to be spent on defense, that money is only meant to go to joint procurement contracts if at least 65% of the cost of production is taking place on European soil. Long story short, this actually responds to the concerns initially raised by the French president, Emmanuel Macron. He wanted to say, yes, guys, we need to spend more on defense, but let's make sure it's more European defense. And this then is very important because when you look at the performance of European defense stocks, year-to-date performance, that is astonishing. The numbers are 3 digits. For instance, for Rheinmetall, we're up more than 100% just since the start of the year. If you look at their performances, the invasion began back in 2022. The numbers we're looking at are about 600%. So we have seen a lot of upside for European defense stocks since the invasion began. But also, in recent times, with this change in narrative from the Europeans and from the conversations I had yesterday, we cannot exclude the possibility that further down the line, the EU could be announcing even more defense spending measures.
Indeed, and that seems like the likely next steps as well. Sylvia, just with regards to where the plan stands today, it's pretty clear Europe has been under pressure from the Trump administration to try and put together some kind of arrangement to increase defense spending to protect their own security ahead of the NATO leaders summit in June. Where is the plan, and how soon before we see some kind of public version of exactly what they intend on doing?
So to some extent, what we have on the table is what we're working with for the next couple of months. They have been very concrete in terms of how they will be spending more on defense, and what we have witnessed in recent times over the last couple of weeks really is just this technical work. However, as we are walking towards that very important NATO summit in early summer, the question here is what sort of new spending measures they will agree within NATO. But that is a complicated argument to have at this stage, because when you think about the EU, not all of the EU countries are part of NATO. So yes, from a European perspective, from an EU perspective, they are spending more on defense, but it remains to be seen how NATO is going to agree on more defense spending measures. What we are hearing from the EU is important in that regard, but we don't know what will be the final threshold that NATO will agree in terms of new defense spending, at least for now. Let me just make one final point when it comes to that. Some European countries, look at Spain, for instance. I had a chance to speak to the Prime Minister yesterday. They're still spending less than the 2% of GDP on defense, and that's what the NATO rules say at this stage. However, as we approach that summit, that NATO summit in a couple of months' time, the idea is to raise that defense target to at least 3%, perhaps even 3.5%. So there is already pressure on countries such as Spain to deliver more on defense and to tell the rest of NATO, including the United States, guys, we will be spending more on defense and we'll reach that new level in the near future. Let's see how that work is going to unfold then.
It's a really important point, particularly as the Trump administration also ramps up its own threats to pull out of NATO itself. So the pressure is really on these leaders. And Sylvia, you do excellent reporting on the ground. You're actually meeting face-to-face and having conversations with these guys about what their plans are. Tell me, is there also a concern on the ground that higher defense spending could ultimately translate to weaker fiscal discipline across the bloc as well? You mentioned the divide that we're seeing between countries like France, Germany, the Netherlands, for example, and Spain. What does that mean for the unity of the bloc overall?
So overall, there's an agreement to spend more on defense. And the measures that we have on the table, they have been greenlit by the heads of state, by all of the heads of state. The question here from a fiscal perspective is that, as I highlighted earlier, some member states are already saying this is not enough and we might need to do even more. Some countries such as Greece, the Greek Prime Minister told me yesterday that we need also grants. We need more borrowing at the EU level for defense as well. However, the other side of this equation is countries such as the Netherlands saying, guys, the measures we have on the table are plenty. We don't need to agree on more defense spending for the time being. And they're, of course, against the idea of additional borrowing and having more grants allowed to be given to the member states. So that fiscal argument is still one to follow over the next couple of months. For the time being, what we have on the table has been agreed, and the markets, however, then we have seen a little bit of a concern in recent times about this additional spending for defense. But all in all, it seems that bond investors for the time being have those concerns that they had initially have dissipated somewhat. But of course, we have to keep an eye on that.
Indeed, and the market reaction is also very, very closely watched. Sylvia, just a final question before we let you go. Of course, these talks about Ukraine's future are now moving to Saudi Arabia, and there's a fresh discussion set to take place in Jeddah this weekend and next week. Two questions here. How do the European leaders feel that the future center of gravity in the conversation about European security has moved to the Middle East? That's number one. And number two, what should we realistically expect from these conversations?
So from the get-go, and the reason why we are seeing the EU trying to do so much more on defense is also because of that, because they have realized, and actually the Ukrainian president had warned for a long time, that the EU is not at the table for the time being in terms of these negotiations potentially with Russia and having potentially a ceasefire for Ukraine. So they're upset about that, they're disappointed about that, but there are ongoing efforts to change that. There are internal efforts, indeed, by seeing all of these announcements coming from the EU. But then let's not forget that members such as Finland, we had the Finnish president meeting with Zelenskyy earlier this week, and there's an idea here to perhaps have at least one leader, one member state trying to be at these conversations in Saudi Arabia, with the United States, with Russia, to see if there is a possibility to have the Europeans also at the table. But that's not the case for the time being. So they are watching from the outside. And indeed, they are monitoring every single comment. They are following the conversations that are happening in Saudi Arabia. They want to understand whether these conversations are for a ceasefire are actually realistic. The commentary that I got yesterday here then was that what we have heard so far in terms of a potential ceasefire is very disappointing news from a European perspective. A lot of the leaders, particularly in Eastern Europe, do not see any sort of truth really coming from the Russian president, and they do not believe that there's a willingness from Russia at this stage to actually end this war. But let's see what happens in the Middle East.
Indeed, those conversations also really critical to understand what is going to happen next. Sylvia, thanks so much for your reporting. Always appreciated, and thank you for your live coverage. You can follow Sylvia online and also check in through the course of Squawk Box Europe as well, where she will continue her reporting as well.